was a cold November evening just after 8:30 p.m. when I came across a listing on an online marketplace. My phone had been acting up lately and I needed a replacement. The ad was simple. Brand new smartphone for sale, cheap, must go tonight. The price was a steal, almost too good to be true. The seller's name was listed as Mike and there was a contact number. I decided to reach out. Mike responded quickly, eager to make the sale that very night. He claimed he needed cash urgently and offered to meet me at a nearby location, a quiet parking lot behind an old strip mall at 9:30 p.m. It wasn't far from my place, so I agreed. I remember feeling a slight unease, but I brushed it off, convincing myself it was just a good deal. By 9:25 p.m., I was already driving through the dimly lit streets, heading towards the meeting spot. The parking lot was deserted, save for a few flickering streetlights and a stray cat that skulked in the shadows. I parked my car near the entrance and waited, keeping a close eye on my surroundings. Minutes later, a beat-up sedan pulled into the lot, and a man in his early 40s stepped out, holding a small box. He waved at me and motioned for me to come over. As I approached, I noticed how worn out he looked, disheveled hair, tired eyes, and clothes that had seen better days. He handed me the box without a word. I opened it and found the phone inside, just as advertised. But something about the whole situation didn't feel right. The phone seemed new, but there was no packaging, no accessories, just the device in a plain, scuffed-up box. Mike was impatient, his eyes darting around nervously as I inspected the phone. "You got the cash?" he asked, his voice low and hurried. I handed him the money, and without another word, he turned and hurried back to his car. As he drove away, I stood there for a moment, feeling a strange mix of relief and unease. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but something about the exchange left me unsettled. I got back in my car and started the drive home. The phone sat on the passenger seat, its screen dark and cold. For some reason, I felt uneasy about using it right away. When I got home, I set the phone aside, planning to check it out the next day. The following morning, I woke up to several missed calls and messages on my old phone. They were from a number I didn't recognize, and the messages were all variations of the same thing. "Call me immediately, it's urgent." I hesitated, but eventually decided to call the number back. A woman answered on the first ring, her voice shaky and desperate. "Did you buy a phone from Mike last night?" she asked. "Yes. Why?" Her voice trembled as she spoke. "You need to get rid of it, now." I was taken aback. "What? Why? What's going on?" "Mike's been selling stolen phones," she explained, her words rushing out. "He's desperate for cash, but the people he's dealing with, they're dangerous. If they find out you have that phone, they'll come after you." Panic started to set in. I had heard stories of stolen goods leading to trouble, but this was different. The woman didn't sound like she was lying, and the urgency in her voice made my heart race. "I didn't know," I stammered. "I'll get rid of it, I promise." But before I could do anything, my doorbell rang. I froze, my mind racing. It was too early for visitors, and I wasn't expecting anyone. I approached the door cautiously and looked through the peephole. A man stood on the porch, his face partially obscured by a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "Delivery," he responded, though he wasn't holding any package. Something was very wrong. My instincts screamed at me to stay quiet, but I felt trapped. The man knocked again, harder this time. "I know you're in there. Open the door." I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. The phone, the calls, the mysterious woman, it all started to piece together. I grabbed the phone from where I had left it and shoved it into a drawer, hoping that would somehow make a difference. The knocking grew louder, more insistent. I could hear the man muttering under his breath, cursing as he tried to jiggle the doorknob. I knew I couldn't just stand there. My only option was to escape. I quietly moved to the back of the house, slipping out through the kitchen door. I made my way around the side, staying low, and peered out at the driveway. My car was parked out front, but there was no way I could reach it without being seen. The man was still at the front door, but I didn't know how much time I had before he noticed I was gone. I bolted for the neighbor's house, keeping close to the bushes for cover. My neighbors were an elderly couple, and I knew they'd be home at this hour. I banged on their door, praying they'd answer quickly. After what felt like an eternity, the door opened, and Mrs. Thompson peered out. "What's going on, dear?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. "Please, I need help," I gasped. "There's someone at my house, and I think they're trying to break in." She let me in, and I could finally catch my breath. As I explained the situation, we heard the sound of tires screeching outside. I rushed to the window and saw the man from my porch speeding away in a black SUV. For the rest of the day, I stayed with the Thompsons, too shaken to go back home. When I finally did, I found my front door slightly ajar. My heart raced as I stepped inside. The house was quiet, but the tension in the air was palpable. I cautiously made my way through each room, checking to see if anything was missing or out of place. When I reached the drawer where I had stashed the phone, I found it open and empty. The phone was gone. A chill ran down my spine. Someone had been inside my house, and they knew exactly what they were looking for. I never saw Mike again, and I never heard from the mysterious woman either. But the experience left a mark on me. I've never felt truly safe in my own home since that day, and every time I see an ad for a deal that seems too good to be true, I remember that night and the terror that followed. About a year ago, I lost my beloved dog, Max. He was a friendly golden retriever, always by my side. One evening, he slipped out the door while I was distracted, and despite my frantic search, I couldn't find him. I was heartbroken. A few days later, I decided to post an ad on Craigslist. I described Max in detail, mentioning his collar, his temperament, and the last place I'd seen him. I offered a reward and included my phone number. I hoped someone might have seen him or might be able to help. The responses were slow at first, but then, about a week later, I received a message that caught my eye. The email was from someone named Elise, and it read, "I believe I've seen your dog. Please call me at phone number as soon as possible. I have important information." The email didn't provide any specifics about where or when she had seen Max, which seemed strange. Despite my reservations, I called the number. Elise answered with a calm and measured tone, saying she had seen a dog matching Max's description in a neighborhood about an hour away. She seemed very certain, but her voice was oddly emotionless. She asked if we could meet at a small park in that neighborhood. I was eager to find Max, so I agreed. When I arrived, Elise was already there, sitting on a bench. She was a woman in her early 50s, with a serious demeanor and an unsettlingly calm presence. She told me that she had seen Max a few days earlier but hadn't been able to catch him. She described seeing him running near an old abandoned house at the edge of the park. Elise said she had tried to approach him, but he had disappeared into the building. I asked her to take me to the house. Her expression grew a bit more tense, but she agreed. As we walked, she spoke in a hushed voice, telling me she had been visiting the neighborhood frequently because she was searching for something important. The abandoned house was a ramshackle structure, overgrown with weeds and covered in grime. The windows were broken and the front door hung off its hinges. Elise led me inside, her footsteps echoing in the empty, musty interior. I felt a growing sense of dread, but was too desperate to find Max to turn back. We searched through the rooms, which were filled with old furniture covered in dust and cobwebs. Elise's demeanor grew more peculiar as we moved through the house. She began muttering to herself about finding what was lost and completing the search. Her words seemed disconnected from the reality of the situation. In one of the back rooms, we found a large old mirror leaning against the wall. Elise seemed particularly drawn to it. She stood in front of the mirror, staring into it with a strange intensity. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I called out for Max again, but there was no response. As I turned to leave, I heard a faint scratching noise coming from behind a door at the end of the hallway. I opened it, and to my horror, I found a small, dimly lit room with old dog cages stacked in a corner. The cages were empty, but the sight made my heart race. It was clear that something sinister had taken place here. I turned around to confront Elise, but she was no longer in sight. I searched the house frantically, but she was gone. I decided to leave, feeling a mix of fear and desperation. When I reached the park again, Elise had vanished, and I couldn't find her contact information. The Craigslist ad had also disappeared, and I could no longer reach her by phone. I returned home, feeling defeated and scared. A few days later, I received an anonymous letter in the mail. Inside was a photograph of Max, looking out from behind bars in one of those old cages. The note read, "I hope you find what you're looking for. Sometimes what you seek is already lost." I never found Max. I tried to investigate further, but the trail had gone cold. The abandoned house was eventually demolished and no records were found of Elise. To this day, I'm haunted by the thought that someone was playing a cruel game with me, using my desperation to hide their own dark secrets. Craigslist had promised help, but delivered only a chilling mystery that I couldn't escape. I was fresh out of college and desperate for a job. The student loans were piling up and I couldn't keep living off my parents forever. That's when I found an ad on Craigslist that seemed perfect. Too perfect, actually. It was for a personal assistant job, offering great pay and flexible hours. The description was vague, but it promised opportunities for growth and required no prior experience. The ad listed a phone number and an email. I figured, why not? I sent a quick email expressing my interest and attached my resume. I got a response within an hour, faster than I expected. The reply was from someone named Mr. Thompson. He said he was a private contractor who handled various tasks for clients, and he needed someone trustworthy to help him manage his workload. He wanted to meet the next day at a coffee shop downtown to discuss the job further. The next day, I arrived at the coffee shop, anxious but excited. I scanned the room for anyone who looked like they were waiting for someone. In the corner, I noticed a man in his 40s, dressed in a suit, staring directly at me. He gave a slight nod, so I approached him. "Are you Mr. Thompson?" I asked. He replied, smiling warmly. He gestured for me to sit. We exchanged pleasantries, and he quickly jumped into explaining the job. It all sounded normal, organizing files, running errands, answering emails. Nothing out of the ordinary except for one thing. "I'll need you to pick up packages for me from time to time," he said, his tone shifting slightly. "Some of my clients prefer discretion, so you'll deliver these packages to them. No questions asked." Something about the way he said it made me uneasy, but I brushed it off. The pay was good, and I really needed the job. I agreed to start the following Monday. For the first week, everything was fine. I mostly handled routine tasks, managing emails, organizing files, making phone calls. Then, one day, Mr. Thompson handed me a sealed envelope. "I need you to deliver this to a client. It's urgent," he said, not making eye contact. He gave me an address that was about an hour's drive from the city. It was in a rural area, far from any main roads. I felt a knot in my stomach, but I didn't want to seem ungrateful. I took the envelope and headed out. As I drove, the scenery changed from bustling city streets to empty, winding roads surrounded by dense forest. The further I went, the more isolated I felt. My GPS showed I was close, but the road ahead was nothing more than a narrow dirt path leading into the woods. I hesitated for a moment, but then turned onto the path. After a few minutes of driving slowly, I saw a small, dilapidated cabin ahead. It looked abandoned. The windows were boarded up, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. I parked the car and got out, clutching the envelope tightly. I approached the cabin, and just as I was about to knock on the door, it creaked open on its own. No one was there. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling. No response. I should have turned around and left right then, but something compelled me to go inside. The interior was even worse. Dust-covered furniture, broken glass on the floor, and the smell of mildew. I saw a small table in the center of the room with a note on it. The note had just one word: run. Suddenly, I heard footsteps behind me, heavy and deliberate. I whipped around to see a figure standing in the doorway, a man tall and gaunt with hollow eyes staring right at me. Before I could react, he lunged at me. I dropped the envelope and bolted out of the cabin, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't dare look back as I raced to my car. As I fumbled with the keys, I could hear him behind me getting closer. I managed to start the car and sped down the dirt path, not stopping until I was back on the main road. My hands were shaking and I was gasping for breath. I didn't stop driving until I reached home. When I finally calmed down, I decided to call Mr. Thompson and tell him what happened. But when I dialed his number, I got a message saying it was no longer in service. I checked the email thread only to find that all his messages had vanished from my inbox. It was like he never existed. I never heard from him again, and I never went back to that part of town. To this day, I don't know what was in that envelope, who that man was. But I do know one thing: I'll never trust a Craigslist job listing again.